I have spent years watching how systems fail. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment that makes headlines and forces immediate action, but slowly, through the accumulation of small decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation but together create conditions from which there is no easy escape. What is happening in California right now is one of the clearest examples of systemic failure I have observed in decades of studying how power, capital, and policy interact. The governor of the fifth largest economy on Earth is losing control of his state's energy infrastructure, and the mechanisms driving this loss of control are far more consequential than any single corporate decision or political statement. When Chevron announced it was relocating its global headquarters from San Ramon, California to Houston, Texas in August of 2024, the immediate reaction focused on symbolism. Here was one of the world's largest energy companies, a corporation that had called California home for nearly a century and a half, packing up and leaving. But symbolism is not what concerns me. What concerns me is what Chevron's departure reveals about the structural contradictions that California has been accumulating for decades. Contradictions that are now producing real consequences that no amount of political rhetoric can paper over. Let me be clear about what I am not saying. I am not suggesting that California's leadership is uniquely incompetent, or that this situation results from any single policy mistake. The crisis unfolding in California is the product of choices made over 40 years by administrations of both parties, by federal regulators and state agencies, by corporate boards and municipal governments, by voters who wanted contradictory things and elected officials who promised to deliver all of them simultaneously. The current governor inherited a system already deep into structural decline, and his responses to that decline, while they have accelerated certain dynamics, did not create the underlying conditions. Understanding this matters because it reveals something important about how complex systems actually fail, and why the failure modes we are witnessing in California may foreshadow similar dynamics in other states and nations. California built the most prosperous economy in American history on a foundation of cheap, abundant energy. The oil fields of Kern County, the refineries of the Bay Area and Los Angeles, the pipelines connecting production to processing to distribution. This infrastructure was constructed over generations at enormous cost. And it worked. For decades, it worked extraordinarily well. California had reliable fuel supplies, competitive prices relative to other West Coast markets, and an industrial base that could support everything from agriculture to aerospace. The system had redundancy built in, multiple refineries, multiple pipelines, multiple shipping routes. If one component failed, others could compensate. This redundancy was not accidental. It was the product of an era when policymakers understood that energy infrastructure requires margin for error, requires spare capacity that might seem wasteful in normal times but becomes essential during disruptions. What happened over the past 4 decades is that this margin for error was systematically eliminated. Not through any grand conspiracy, but through the relentless logic of efficiency optimization and regulatory accumulation. Each individual decision made sense in its own context. Closing a refinery that was losing money seemed reasonable. Adding environmental requirements that increased operating costs seemed necessary. Blocking pipeline expansions that faced community opposition seemed democratic. Allowing the workforce of specialized pipeline operators and refinery technicians to age without replacement seemed like a market outcome. But these individually reasonable decisions compounded. The system lost its redundancy. The margin for error disappeared. And now California finds itself in a position where the loss of a single pipeline or the closure of a single refinery creates cascading effects that ripple through the entire state economy. The San Pablo Bay pipeline shutdown in December of 2025 illustrates this dynamic perfectly. This was a 300-mile pipeline that had carried crude oil from the Bakersfield oil fields to Northern California refineries for 70 years. At its peak, it moved 100,000 barrels of crude oil daily. The infrastructure represented billions of dollars in investment accumulated over generations. And it died from financial starvation, losing $2 million every month until the operating companies simply could not continue. The pipeline was running at 30% capacity most days, but fixed costs remained constant whether it moved 30,000 barrels or 100,000. The mathematics became impossible. Now consider what happens when that pipeline closes. Northern California refineries that depended on it, facilities like Marathon's Martinez plant and the remaining operational capacity in the region, suddenly lose their primary crude oil source. The crude oil still exists in the ground in Kern County. The refineries still have processing capacity. But the connection between production and processing has been severed. Alternative transport methods exist in theory. Ships could deliver crude to Bay Area ports, but the marine terminals lack capacity for large volume increases. Rail transport from Bakersfield would require hundreds of tank cars operating daily, infrastructure that does not exist. Trucking would need thousands of truck trips weekly, destroying roads and costing astronomically more than pipeline transport. The pipeline made economic sense precisely because all alternatives do not work at scale. This is what I mean by systemic failure. It is not that any single component broke catastrophically. It is that the relationships between components degraded until the system could no longer perform its basic function. California still has oil production. California still has refining capacity, though less than before. California still has consumers who need fuel, but the connective tissue linking these elements has been so weakened that the system cannot reliably deliver fuel from where it is produced to where it is needed at prices consumers can afford. The refinery closure cascade compounds this dynamic. Phillips 66 closed its Los Angeles refinery in late 2025. Valero announced the closure of its Benicia facility for April of 2026. Together, these closures eliminate approximately 284,000 barrels per day of refining capacity, roughly 21% of what California had remaining. And these are not isolated business decisions made in a vacuum. They are responses to the same structural pressures that killed the San Pablo Bay pipeline. Operating costs that exceed revenue. Regulatory compliance burdens that accumulate faster than efficiency gains. Workforce challenges as experienced technicians retire without sufficient replacements. Capital requirements for maintenance and upgrades that cannot be justified when the future of the industry in California looks increasingly uncertain. Each refinery that closes makes the remaining refineries more valuable but also more vulnerable. There is less competition, which in theory should allow survivors to charge higher prices and improve margins. But there is also less redundancy, which means any disruption at a remaining facility has outsized impact on state fuel supplies. The system becomes simultaneously more profitable for those who remain, and more fragile for everyone who depends on it. This is not a stable equilibrium. It is a deteriorating spiral where each closure increases the probability and severity of the next disruption. I want you to understand what happens to fuel prices in this environment, because the mechanism is not what most people assume. The common narrative frames price increases as the result of corporate greed, oil companies choosing to charge more because they can. This narrative is not entirely wrong, but it misses the structural reality that makes such pricing possible. When California had 40 refineries competing for customers, no single company could raise prices dramatically without losing market share to competitors. When California has fewer than a dozen refineries, and when those refineries face capacity constraints that limit how much fuel they can produce regardless of demand, the competitive dynamics change fundamentally. Companies do not need to collude or coordinate. The structure of the market itself produces higher prices. Economists have documented what they call the mystery surcharge in California gasoline prices, a premium that first appeared after the Torrance refinery explosion in February of 2015, and has persisted ever since. Even after accounting for California's high taxes, environmental regulations, and special fuel blend requirements, prices remained 30 to 50 cents per gallon above what the underlying cost structure would predict. This surcharge has cost California drivers an estimated $59 billion over roughly a decade. It exists because the market structure allows it to exist. Reduce the number of competitors, eliminate redundant capacity, and prices rise even without any explicit decision to raise them. The market finds the new equilibrium, and that equilibrium is higher. Now layer onto this structural reality the policy responses that Sacramento has implemented. The state created a new division of petroleum market oversight with authority to investigate and penalize oil companies suspected of price manipulation. Fines can reach $1 million per day for violations. The state mandated strict minimum inventory levels, requiring companies to keep up to 16 days of fuel on hand at all times. The state added requirements, investigations, reporting obligations. Each measure was framed as protecting consumers from corporate abuse. And perhaps some of these measures do provide some protection against some forms of price manipulation. But they also increase operating costs, add compliance burdens, and create additional uncertainty for companies already questioning whether continued California operations make financial sense. The timing of Phillips 66's Los Angeles closure announcement is instructive. The company announced the shutdown just 2 days after the governor signed the inventory mandate legislation into law. Company representatives explicitly cited the new compliance costs and regulatory environment as factors in the decision. Now, perhaps this was pure coincidence. Perhaps Phillips 66 was going to close that refinery regardless of any new legislation. But the message received by every other energy company operating in California was unmistakable. New regulations preceded another major closure. Whether the causation was direct or indirect, the correlation was visible to everyone making investment decisions. This brings me to Chevron, and to what its departure actually signifies beyond the symbolic loss of a corporate headquarters. Chevron was not just another oil company operating in California. It was, in many ways, the oil company of California, the descendant of Standard Oil of California, rooted in the state since the 1880s. When a company with that history, with those roots, with that institutional memory, decides to relocate its global headquarters to Texas, it is not making a statement about tax rates or regulatory convenience. It is making a judgment about the long-term viability of operating in California's energy sector. Headquarters locations matter because they signal where a company sees its future. They affect recruitment, culture, relationships with policymakers. Chevron looked at California's trajectory and concluded its future lay elsewhere. The governor's response to Chevron's departure was to call proposals for increased offshore drilling idiotic and to continue framing oil companies as adversaries to be regulated and constrained, rather than partners in maintaining energy security. This response is consistent with the political incentives the governor faces. His coalition includes environmental activists who view fossil fuel companies as enemies. His policy framework treats the energy transition as something to be accelerated rather than managed. His rhetoric must satisfy constituents who believe that pressure on oil companies is inherently virtuous regardless of consequences for fuel supplies or prices. But here is what I observe from outside that political logic. California consumes approximately 13.1 million gallons of gasoline every single day. The upcoming refinery closures will remove nearly that same amount from daily production capacity. There is no pipeline bringing fuel from the Gulf Coast refineries that serve most of America. Imports from Asia and other West Coast sources are already at record highs, and the shipping lanes are long and vulnerable to disruption. The physical reality of energy supply does not respond to political rhetoric. It responds to infrastructure capacity, transport logistics, refining capability, and all of these are deteriorating simultaneously in California. The human consequences of this deterioration are already visible. Refinery workers who spent careers developing specialized skills face unemployment in an industry that is shrinking. Pipeline operators with certifications that do not transfer to other sectors must rebuild careers from nothing. Small gas station owners face compliance deadlines for underground storage tank upgrades that require capital they cannot access. Drivers who commute 40 miles to jobs that have not given raises in years watch fuel costs consume ever larger portions of stagnant incomes. These are not abstractions. These are families recalculating budgets, businesses reconsidering locations, communities losing the economic anchors that sustained them for generations. Kern County, where California's oil production is concentrated, generates $15 billion annually from petroleum operations. 20,000 jobs relate directly to oil extraction and transport. When pipelines close and producers cannot ship their crude economically, wells get capped permanently. Workers lose jobs. Tax revenue that funded schools and services disappears. The economic devastation ripples through Central Valley communities that never developed alternative economic foundations because oil was always there, always reliable, always the baseline on which everything else rested. What I find most troubling about California's situation is not any single policy or decision but the apparent inability of the political system to acknowledge trade-offs. The state wants to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels while maintaining reliable fuel supplies during the transition. It wants to impose costs on oil companies while expecting those companies to continue investing in California operations. It wants to reduce domestic production while remaining insulated from international supply disruptions. It wants environmental benefits without economic costs. These desires are contradictory. They cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. Yet the political discourse proceeds as if acknowledging trade-offs is itself a form of failure or corruption. The governor's office dismissed academic projections of potential $8 gasoline as unscientific analysis from professors with industry ties. The framing was defensive and personal rather than substantive. Perhaps the specific projections were too aggressive. Perhaps prices will stabilize below the worst-case scenarios. But attacking the credibility of those raising concerns does not address the underlying structural vulnerabilities that make such scenarios plausible. It does not build new refineries or reopen closed pipelines or create alternative transport infrastructure. It does not solve the problem. It merely postpones the political reckoning. What happens next depends on factors that are genuinely uncertain. Global oil prices could fall, easing pressure on California consumers even as local supply constraints persist. Alternative fuel adoption could accelerate faster than expected, reducing gasoline demand and partially offsetting supply reductions. New shipping arrangements could bring more imported fuel to California ports, though at premium prices that consumers must ultimately pay. Some combination of market adjustments and policy changes could stabilize the situation short of genuine crisis. These outcomes are possible. I do not claim to know with certainty how California's energy future will unfold, but I do know that the structural trajectory is deteriorating. Each refinery that closes removes capacity that will not be rebuilt. Each pipeline that shuts down severs connections that cannot be easily restored. Each experienced worker who leaves the industry takes knowledge and capability that requires years to replace. The system is losing resilience faster than it is building alternatives. And resilience, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct. The broader pattern here extends well beyond California. What we are witnessing is a collision between political timelines and infrastructure realities. Politicians operate on 2-year and 4-year cycles, responding to immediate pressures and constituent demands. Infrastructure operates on 30-year and 50-year cycles, requiring sustained investment and maintenance that spans multiple political generations. When political incentives diverge from infrastructure requirements, the infrastructure eventually fails. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, through the accumulation of deferred maintenance and abandoned investment and regulatory burden that makes operation untenable. California is experiencing this collision acutely because it pursued aggressive energy transition policies while its legacy infrastructure was already aging and underinvested. Other states and nations face similar dynamics on different timelines. The energy transition requires building new systems while maintaining old systems through a transitional period that could last decades. This requires policy frameworks that can hold contradictory goals in balance, that can simultaneously accelerate new technologies and preserve necessary old infrastructure, that can acknowledge trade-offs honestly rather than pretending they do not exist. I do not see such frameworks emerging in California. I see instead a political system that treats energy policy as a battleground for ideological positioning rather than a domain requiring pragmatic management of complex systems. I see rhetoric that frames corporate decisions as moral failures rather than rational responses to incentive structures that policy creates. I see constituents who have been promised that the energy transition will be painless and cost-free, and politicians who cannot acknowledge that this promise was always impossible to keep. The governor is losing control not because he is uniquely weak or incompetent, but because the situation has evolved beyond what any individual leader can manage through traditional political tools. He cannot force Chevron to stay. He cannot command closed refineries to reopen. He cannot legislate pipelines into economic viability. He cannot regulate his way to energy security when the underlying physical infrastructure is deteriorating faster than policy can adapt. The tools available to political leaders are powerful for shaping incentives over time, but they are weak for responding to infrastructure crises that required different decisions years or decades earlier. What California needed 20 years ago was investment in redundancy, maintenance of spare capacity, development of workforce pipelines, policy frameworks that balanced environmental goals with energy security requirements. What California did instead was optimize for efficiency, eliminate redundancy, defer maintenance, let workforce expertise age out, and layer regulatory requirements without considering cumulative impacts on system viability. The bill for those choices is now coming due, and no amount of current political action can fully compensate for decisions not made when they would have mattered. I find no satisfaction in this analysis. California's struggles do not validate any particular ideology or political faction. They represent a failure of governance that implicates everyone who participated in decisions over decades. They reveal limitations in how democratic systems manage long-term infrastructure challenges. They demonstrate how easily complex systems can deteriorate when no single entity is responsible for maintaining overall system health. The fuel that powers California's economy must find a path from source to consumer. When the infrastructure enabling that path degrades beyond repair, alternatives must be found, or demand must be suppressed, or imports must increase, or some combination of these adjustments must occur. Markets will find equilibrium eventually. But the equilibrium California is approaching involves higher prices, less reliability, more vulnerability to disruption, and continued erosion of the industrial base that affordable energy once supported. This is not apocalypse. California will not cease to function. Fuel will continue to flow, at higher prices and with less security than before. Life will continue. Adjustments will be made. But the margin for error that once protected California from disruption is gone. The redundancy that once absorbed shocks has been eliminated. The system operates now at the edge of its capacity, where any additional stress produces consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate disruption. I have watched systems approach this condition before, and the pattern is consistent. Problems that would once have been absorbed become crises. Crises that would once have been contained become cascades. Leaders who once had options find themselves reacting to events rather than shaping them. This is where California's energy system stands today. Not in collapse, but in a condition of fragility where collapse becomes possible in ways it was not before. The question now is not whether California can avoid all consequences of the structural deterioration that has already occurred. That ship has sailed. The question is whether California can stabilize its current position, prevent further deterioration, and begin the long process of rebuilding resilience while simultaneously pursuing the energy transition it has committed to achieve. This is an extraordinarily difficult challenge requiring policy sophistication, political courage, and sustained commitment across multiple administrations and political cycles. I do not know if California's political system is capable of meeting this challenge. What I know is that the challenge exists whether or not leaders acknowledge it, and that the consequences of failure will be borne by ordinary Californians who did not create this situation but must now live with its results. The infrastructure that connected California's oil fields to its refineries for 70 years is dying. The refineries that processed crude into the fuel California needs are closing. The companies that operated this system are leaving or reducing their California presence. And the political leadership continues to frame oil companies as adversaries to be punished rather than partners in maintaining energy security during an inevitably long transition period. Something will have to change. Either policy adapts to structural reality, or structural reality will force adaptations that policy cannot control. California is learning, painfully, that energy systems do not respond to political preferences. They respond to physics, economics, and the accumulated consequences of decisions made over generations. The physics have not changed, the economics have become brutal, and the consequences are now arriving.